Okay, well, welcome and thank you everyone who's come from near round bits of Sheffield or from far across the country. It's lovely to see everyone here. And I do have to apologise because at the moment my life consists of rearranging. So this meeting was originally going to be at 8, and then I said, can we make it 8:30 because I'll be in a debate until 8:30. And now it's turned out that I'm afraid I have to leave at 9 p.m. Because I have to go and ask the Minister a question on the housing statement from yesterday in the Commons, which does have at least a nice circularity to it. So what we're going to do is John and I are going to have a discussion, a chat for about half an hour. Then I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappear. And the suggestion is perhaps if everyone who wants to would like to make a contribution, have a discussion at that point. It's possible I'll be able to come back and join you depending on how long my other session takes. I'll leave them both running. But I'm afraid that's just House of Lords at the moment. It's very difficult to predict my schedule and to try and find some spare space. We've only just gone back to sitting on Mondays. So housing. We're kind of focused on Sheffield, but the story of Sheffield is of course very much the short story of most of the country, which is visibly before the COVID-19 crisis, visibly rising levels of homelessness, people struggling to afford, particularly young people struggling to afford even to rent a room in a house and certainly to rent a home of their own, struggling very hard, extremely difficult to actually afford to buy a home. And the quality of housing, often being really terrible, something the Greens have often focused on. I actually did a 4-hour Zoom meeting a couple of weeks ago now with a group called the Westminster Forum on domestic home energy efficiency. And this figure's a few years old now, but a couple of years ago, we were in Britain, we were the second worst for fuel poverty in countries in Western Europe. We weren't quite as bad as Lithuania. And that was in large part because the quality of our housing stock is so poor. So we're talking about the cost of housing, the lack of housing that meets people's needs, and the fact that our housing, the fabric of it, is just really terribly poor. So that's why I'm hoping to hold through lockdown a whole series of discussions about various topics. And housing really seemed a very logical first one because it's something that is such a pressing issue before COVID-19. But if we think about the situation, and I'm about to hope to go and ask the Minister a question about the bedroom tax. Now that's a situation where people, if we think about the impact of the bedroom tax under COVID-19, that bedroom tax was trying to force families to see that children under 16 sharing a bedroom. We think about with COVID-19, what that has done to people's lives. Lockdown, where, say a 15 and a 13-year-old are sharing a bedroom. Lockdown, where someone in the household has to self-isolate. Maybe there's 2 teenagers and 2 adults in a 2-bedroom house, and someone is trying to self-isolate because of COVID symptoms. Housing policy has made the COVID situation actually much worse. So that's my kind of general introduction. So I'm going to try not to talk too much because that's a terrible politician habit, and start with John to ask really a question of, starting with COVID-19, what are you seeing, what impacts are you seeing from COVID-19 as someone who's very concerned with housing policy?
My concerns about it are right from the top down, Natalie. I mean,
Can't hear you, John.
Oh, I'm not muted. Don't know what's going on. Is that any better?
No, we can hear you. Yep.
All right.
Just a little louder, John, if you can.
Right. Okay. I'm shouting at the computer at the moment, but I'll do what I can. Yeah. I mean, my concerns about housing, they've changed in some ways with COVID because obviously it's changed the situation. But I had major systemic concerns about the way that the Tories were approaching housing policy beforehand, and that basic underlying fear about what they're doing hasn't really changed. I think they've got a very sinister agenda towards pushing more and more people into rented accommodation and cutting the amount of opportunity people have to be independent through owning their own properties. They've no idea of or seem to have no idea of what they're doing with sustainable housing at all. And yeah, we keep seeing time and time again, they're making it more and more difficult for small businesses SMEs to enter the market, to bring in innovation, and easier and easier for big companies to corner the market in what they're doing with off-site and modern methods of construction, which are clearly the way forward for building the houses that we need. But as usual with the Tories, there's no consultation. There's no thinking about what people actually want, what houses they want, and where they want them. They're just going ahead and doing the usual. Let's make sure our friends in the construction industry are making as much money as possible. And I view the whole construction industry as a money laundering cartel, basically, and it needs the whole thing needs turning on its head. We're building supposedly up to 300,000 new houses a year, which is still going to be a climate change problem in 100 years' time, because nobody has to put any sustainable features into them above the very basic levels that are contained in building regs. And it's, as with many other areas of their policy, it's due for a massive shake-up so that it's far more fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting things in there that perhaps people mightn't have thought out about so much. It's starting with the modern methods of construction. I mean, one of the things I've seen is I was actually at an economic conference in Poland, as one is, and I was talking to a guy in Poland who was making very, very energy efficient prefabbed homes, particularly for the Scandinavian and German market. And these were passive house standard or better. And I mean, he was interesting because he was saying he'd love to see some British apprentices come and join him because, of course, the working language that his customers used was English with him, and he found it hard to find Polish builders with the English skills. And so do you see in other parts of particularly Europe that moving towards that prefab, very energy efficient is happening much faster than it is in Britain, if it's happening here at all?
Yeah, it's happening across the world far better than it's happening here. I mean, we are still in the very early days of MMC, and they've been making noises about it for a little while now, but the government aren't really pushing that. They're being pushed into it by a few very focused people like Mark Farmer, who wrote the Modernise or Die report back in 2015. And there is an increasing level of investment in modern methods of construction, but they've kind of jumped on that and just seen it as an opportunity for big companies to build lots of houses, again, identikit houses on large sites, and that's all being facilitated through Homes England and the land disposal systems that they've got in place, which just favour the big money and the big contracts. So social value of land. I mean, we're giving away hundreds of acres of public land to big builders every year to build expensive houses that most people can't dream of affording. Why is that happening? Why isn't there a ring fence around some of that public land to allow us to build houses to avoid having a housing crisis anymore? It's not happening. The housing associations are becoming increasingly, they're behaving increasingly like developers because they're being forced down that economic route. They're having to build houses to sell to finance building the social houses that they're doing. The councils haven't really got to grips with building more council housing because they've lost the expertise, they've lost all the trained staff that they had before, and they don't know how to actually build council houses anymore. So they're putting all that out through PFI or arm's length organisations. And that's getting out of hand, and that's all coming in at market price as well. So nobody's really looking at doing anything a different way, and that's why I think the opportunity we've got at the minute with Build Back Better to look at a very different way of doing what we need to do in the future. But is there anybody out there who's going to listen to people with different ideas? Because at the minute it's all being done through the existing mechanisms with the existing companies, and nobody's really looking at doing it a different way. Even people like Urban Splash, who are one of the big exciting offsite manufacturers. I mean, they've just turned into another massive money making company. They're not the exciting, iconoclastic, let's do housing differently firm that they were 5-6 years ago, because they've just got awash with money. And they've kind of lost their mission on changing the way that they do housing. So they're just making a lot of money out of it, and happy days for them. But we really have got an opportunity to change the housing market and provide affordable, sustainable housing for more people, and whether that's on mixed tenure, social rent, properly affordable social rent, or outright ownership. There's a massive opportunity to do things very differently.
I'm just going to pull out the phrase you used there. I guess most people are probably aware of it, but Build Back Better is being used as a hashtag and a slogan for thinking about what comes after, as we come to terms with COVID-19, and how we don't want to go back to normal, quotes unquote. Normal was absolutely disastrous. People were stricken with poverty and inequality. And so we need to rebuild something different and better as we deal with the impacts of COVID-19.
Yeah, and
I think I think it's worth picking out what you were talking about, the big house builders. I won't never forget a couple of years ago, I saw a graph of what had happened since the financial crash of 2007-8, and basically the profits of the big builders was a line like that, and the number of houses they built was a line crossing over like that. So basically, the fewer houses they built, the larger profits they made. And of course, their job as companies, as shareholder value capitalism we operate under, their job is to make money. And the other thing is, of course, the quality of what they're building. And there's been some absolute horror stories and focus on one or two companies, but the actual standard of what they're building, the size of what they're building. I mean, when I used to live in London, the idea of what they called a modern luxury flat, in which a double bedroom, you could just fit a double bed in it. And you could kind of walk beside the double bed if you just shuffled sideways and pulled your ankles in a bit. We're not building, we're building very small homes compared to European standards. So, how do we actually start to look to force the big builders to higher standards? Do we need actually a kind of, as we used to have, a standard of size of building as well as a standard for the fabric of building?
Well, we have got the homes standard, which specifies how big they have to be, and I would argue with that, and there's because that precludes against building smaller homes, and the tiny homes movement, and what I'm trying to do with the container housing. I mean, what is wrong with people having a choice to have a smaller home if that's what they want? If it's the choice of having a roof over their head or being stuck in a drafty, mould-ridden private rented place because that's the only thing that you can afford. It's tough paying out 60 or 70% of your income trying to keep a roof over your head if that roof is never ever going to be yours. It's that's tough trying to do it that way. So just remind me what you were.
I'm talking about sort of the big builders and how we ideally we'd like to break them up and stop them dominating, but what can we do to stop them running wild, really?
Yeah. Okay. And I think the competition that modern methods of construction is going to give them, if it's allowed to really take off, and let's face it, construction is the least efficient sector of our industry. It's famously inefficient and has been for a long time. We're still building houses the way the Victorians used to build them. The oft quoted analogy is you wouldn't build a car in a field, and that's effectively what we're doing with housing. That's the way it's been done. But if you build a modular home in a factory, not only is it far better working conditions for the people who are actually working on the houses, you can have far better quality control, you can have far better control of your materials and your waste. 25% of everything that goes onto a traditional building site at the moment either gets wasted, damaged or stolen. So that's immediately adding 25% into the materials cost of every home that gets built. And who pays for that on top of the profits for the big house builders, which are, the whole thing about margins in the building industry is quite technical and complicated, but basically the big developers they're laughing all the way to the bank. Persimmon Homes made over £1 billion, I think, last year, and they're not even the biggest house builder. And a lot of that, famously, the bonuses that were being paid out to some of their top execs in the last few years have been subject to media comment, and I won't, because there are probably children listening, so I won't say what I think about them. But yeah, we need competition, and we need something to take over from the traditional housing market, because there's going to be a dearth of skilled staff in the forthcoming years, because the age profile in the building industry is such that there's a lot of people going to be retiring. If and when Brexit kicks in, and we lose the 30% of workers from abroad who currently are an important part of the building industry, there's going to be far fewer people to build. There's a lot of big infrastructure projects. If HS2 goes ahead, there's going to be increased competition for the fewer number of people there are there. And training for builders in this country is still training them to build the same way the Victorians did. It's all brickwork, blockwork, and roof trusses. We need to be training people how to put up solar panels and how to build with passive house energy efficiency standards to make the homes cheaper to run. To make them less resource intensive in the future. I mean, power prices are not going to go down anytime soon. Water costs are going to go up, and competition for water is going to be far more intense in the future. We need to be more sparing in the way we use resources all the way around, and carrying on doing it with the traditional materials that we're using now, most of which are not environmentally friendly. It's Neolithic kind of thinking. We need to move into the 21st century properly with the way we build houses, and so we need to build the houses that people want, where they want them, and the whole agenda not to be run by the building industry, which is what it is at the moment.
We have a question, Natalie. We have a question from Ray.
Yep.
Who are the most effective modular builders? Are they international? Are any of them cooperatives, or are they all capitalist corporations?
John, I'll throw that to you.
Good question. You might need to remind me of some of the parts of it as we go through, but the most effective modular, that's a good question. So the industry in this country
could you explain what modular building means?
Modular building is, modular modern methods of construction. We're talking about basically houses that are built in a factory, not actually on site, and then the units or the individual modules of the home are transported to site and put together very quickly on site onto a pre-prepared base, basically, and then the external, the roof or the external cladding or whatever's put on as a finish. So it's a very quick process, basically, but essentially the fabric of your house is built in a factory rather than in a field. There are a number of reasonably sized companies who are trying to get things underway, but even people like Legal and General Affordable Homes, who are probably the most have the most money behind them because they're part of Legal and General Insurance Group, and they've put about 175 million pounds into modular over the last 5 years. They've got a huge factory in Sherburn and Elmet, and even they have had problems getting contracts to build their homes. There are some of the other big companies like Ilka. They've got a big factory in Nottingley. Again, it's a huge factory, and they're using probably 10% of it at the moment because with local authorities particularly and other commissioning people are still stuck in the idea that rather than modular, the word prefab keeps on coming up, and obviously there's a lot of negative connotations still with those from the wartime. So it's making it difficult for new companies, even people say like Legal and General, and I don't think of some of the other big ones who are taking the leap into modular. Lang O'Rourke, Berkeley Homes, they're all big players who are getting in on the game, but they're having to invest a lot of money up front to get their R&D and their production facilities put in place because they cost millions of pounds for huge factories like that. So on the face of it, the homes themselves are not particularly cheap to start with. It's this sort of R&D bubble which front loads the cost at the beginning of manufacturing. But once those facilities are in place and the economies of scale kick in, and the workforces are trained up, obviously, it becomes a much cheaper process, and that's what's going to bring the costs down and speed up the process of building. There were a couple of other aspects to the question.
I think we've probably mainly covered it. There is another question I thought I'd throw in from Brian Homeshaw. Do we need a whole new set of apprenticeships in passive house standards and in social housing too?
Yes, absolutely, we do. Something I've been involved in trying to push that forward. Other people are trying to do it. It's something that there are a number of organisations such as Constructing Excellence, the Construction Leadership Council and the CITB who should have been doing this, and they've been sat on their hands for the last 5 or 10 years and completely failed the industry in spotting what needed to be done. So those people are talking about those things. The main guy who's driving it at the moment is George Clark, if anybody's seen him on TV with his Small Spaces program. But he's set up an organisation called MOBI, which is trying to pull together sustainable building training on a national level. So it's kind of happening, but it's not being driven by government. It's being driven by concerned individuals within the sector.
And I think, bouncing off that, I mean, that training problem, I'm a builder's daughter, and we just are not training people in the UK, and the standards of our build quality are often awful. And I've been doing quite a lot of work on health and safety recently because, of course, construction workers are right at the top of the death toll from COVID-19. It's higher even than health workers, which probably surprises lots of people. But one of the things that came out around that is about 60% of manual construction workers are actually technically self-employed, in many cases fake self-employment, working only for one person. And, associated with those structures are basically, whole sites with no apprentices, because they're just using the cheapest labour they can possibly find with no commitment, no holiday pay, no sick pay. And that's also an environment people aren't, understandably not necessarily going to want to go into.
Exactly, as a career choice for people in school. I mean, who would want to go into that?
Just something else I think perhaps it's worth picking up, and I'm not surprised to see there's a comment in the chat about land value tax, which is a long-term Green Party policy I knew we'd get to this evening. Just particularly thinking about the Sheffield situation, which I think in many ways is typical. There is obviously no shortage of potential brownfield housing sites in Sheffield. I've been taking my hour-long, takes about 3.5 miles walks around starting from above the Park Hill Flats, and I walk past an awful lot of potential housing sites in pretty well any direction I go in. But we've got talk of building on the green belt out near Dole, because that's where they want to build the luxury, sprawling executive homes. So what we need also really is stronger planning policies, I think. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely. And Declan's issue about land values. Land is worth what somebody's going to pay for it. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of land that's owned by us, which could be built on via Homes England and the government and the councils. They're constrained at the moment by their thinking about best value on land, and my point has always been with that, there's a financial best value, obviously, and while everybody's cash strapped, that's going to be at the forefront of their thinking, but there's also a social best value to disposal of that land, in terms of we've got a housing crisis which deeply affects people's life chances. There's £28 billion bill every year for housing benefit. There's a lot of money that can be saved there by giving people the wherewithal to get a roof over their own head and not be dependent on housing benefit. And we shouldn't have working families who are dependent on handouts. Surely that shouldn't even be part of a capitalist system, and certainly not one that I want to be living under.
Which is, I'm going to have to go fairly shortly, but what you say there in talking about housing benefit means I really do have to bring up right to buy, because of course it has been long-term Green Party policy to be opposed to right to buy, and you may or may not agree with this, John, I don't know, but it's one of the great privatisations. Lots of people talk about privatisations of the NHS, privatisation of the railways, etc. But what we had was essentially, a public asset housing that was then actually sold off And whilst theoretically this was supposed to be going to owner-occupiers, about a third of it is now in the hand of private landlords. And so you actually have people paying, having to claim housing benefit to live in what used to be a public asset. And that's just money straight going into the hands of private landlords, very often private landlords who own hundreds or even thousands of homes. It's not just, there are some cases of people who, just have one or two homes, but a lot of them are bulk situations. Yeah. So, what's your thoughts about right to buy? And, really, we've got to restore that housing stock, I would suggest.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. The current way that right to buy is set up is a fiddle. And it is playing into the hands of people who are making a massive amount of money out of it. I don't disagree with right to buy, provided you're putting enough housing stock in at the bottom, and if you're building enough affordable housing stock and it's being sold to people who are then going to live in it, and it's going to be privately owned in perpetuity and not be bought up by landlords, then I think there is a place for it, because it allows people to aspire to have a roof over their head. And what's wrong with the disconnect with the current system is we're not building enough affordable houses to replace the ones that are being sold. We've been talking to South Yorkshire Housing Association about building some reach homes for them, because the figures that Tony Stacey quoted to me, they have to sell a house that will cost them 135,000 to rebuild, and they have to sell that under right to buy. And this is a housing association, not a council. They have to sell that for 85 grand. Now, that's not a sustainable business model for a housing association, which is why I said earlier on, they've got to think more from the point of view of a commercial developer. But if they have somebody who can build them a new home for 65 grand, which we can, and other companies will be able to as well. It's not just about me, but if you've got a supply of decent, I'm not talking about knockoff, drafty, mouldy houses. It's got to be built beautifully to a quality standard, and it's got to be something that people can aspire to live in and want to aspire to live in. But if you've got enough supply coming in at the bottom end that's affordable, then you can have a right to buy system that works. And I see it, part of my vision is to be able to have apprentices coming in and working for us who can build themselves a house while they're working for us, that they can then afford to live in, because it's an affordable house that's affordable because it's got very low fuel bills. It's affordable to live in, and they can then carry on, get a job somewhere else in the construction industry or whatever. And it's changing people's life chances, but it's about removing the value that's being added into the housing system by the people who want to take that value out. And there's money is being hemorrhaged out of the economy particularly through housing, and it's all going into the wrong pockets, and it's all being removed from the economy. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit here, but yeah.
I think Natalie's got to go, haven't you?
I've got to go in a minute. So I'm going to try and come back if I possibly can, and just here at the end of the discussion. But before I do, I think what you were just saying, John, really leads into something that's sort of my top line on housing, which is that we have to stop treating housing as primarily a financial asset, and go back to thinking of homes as being there to give people safe, affordable, reliable, secure places to live. And one of the interesting things was I was actually in the debate on the Grenfell disaster a couple of months ago, and I actually heard one of the bishops say virtually exactly that phrase. I don't know if he'd been reading my speeches or not, but it was nice to hear one of the bishops in the House of Lords saying that. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Eamon and head off to the House of Lords and come back later. Apologies for having to do that.
Thanks, Natalie. Thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute everybody. We've got a relatively small number of people on the call, so we'll make this we can turn this into a bit more of a discussion. We've got a couple more questions here. John, are you happy if we widen it a little bit to all the housing issues relating to Corona? So we maybe talk about the situation about renters under pressure to pay their rent, that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. I'm
okay.
Pretend to be an expert on all of that kind of stuff, but I'm happy to.
Okay, but we've got some good questions, and if anyone wants to come in, just just take the opportunity. Just say you want to come in when there's a gap, and hopefully we'll be okay. So we have got another question from Declan. In fact, Declan, would you like? Well, you mentioned George Monbiot in comments. Would you like to ask your question or?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm just getting attacked by the cat because it's his dinner time. I was just asking, but so George Monbiot and a few others did a report for the Labour Party called Land for the Many. And, a lot of it is very familiar if you look at the Green Party policy around housing. But I was just wondering whether it be possible, people think it's a good idea if we were to ask George Monbiot and that grouping to make a similar report to the Green Party, because it would help us to develop policy that moves us forward, but also it kind of highlights where Labour didn't move forward and they had the opportunity to.
Just before you come in, John, if anybody has any sound issues because I've taken people off mute, do shout and we'll review it. But do go ahead, John.
I'd love to talk to George Monbiot about many things, not just the housing, but yeah, I'd love to get a symposium together in Sheffield to look at the way we approach the whole issue of land supply and who owns it and what's done with it. And we can look at the way Sheffield's done housing policy over the last 5 or 10 years. We can ask why there's still 33,000 people on the council waiting list and they're not building homes for those people, but yet they're turning the manor into a virtually gated community of 4 and 5 bedroom houses that nobody up there can afford. I've been in a meeting today. We've through the Chamber of Commerce. We've had a look at the new strategic economic plan for Sheffield City region, and the bit on land and housing in there is it's all very nicely worded, but it's all smoke and mirrors, and it's quite clear from reading between the lines that it's going to, if they do go down the line of modern methods of construction, it's all going to be done on same old terms through big companies, and they'll all be out of town companies, so all the money's going out of Sheffield again. So yeah, we need a local discussion about like I say, that the homes we need here and the homes that people want to live in, rather than what we're told we're having.
We have. Oh, sorry. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Okay, James, you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I was just curious with the need for social distancing now and probably for a long time to come. With new methods of construction, is there more achievability in social distancing compared with traditional construction? And how do you see that general issue developing?
Yeah, I think it's very much easier to control within a factory environment, obviously, rather than it is on a building site. You've got more control over your workforce. You've got a smaller workforce who work for you rather than it being a load of subcontractors. Your training issues around how you actually do the social distancing are a lot easier to bring in, and the processes and procedures that you need to
You're a little quiet again, John.
Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with the microphone.
That's better.
It's much easier in a factory environment to control social distancing and make sure that things are getting wiped down, and and the appropriate PPE is being used.
Okay. Does anybody else want to ask a question, make a contribution? Could I just ask John, I don't know if this is your territory, but just looking at a planning application for the old Hepworth site in Loxley, and I asked Andrew Cooper, who's the spokesperson for the Green Party, has he got can he offer any help in terms of planning guidances on flood building on floodplains? Is there anything within planning rules now to stop that? And he basically said the national planning guidance is out of date. Just wondered if you had any views on sort of out of date guidance, and also the climate emergency and building on floodplains.
Obviously, there's increasing pressure on building companies to build on floodplain land because it's cheaper, and despite the fact that they have to spend a lot of money on flood remediation and so on, it's still a lot of the time, because of what they're building on there, they can make it stack up. where I'm working up in West Yorkshire at the moment, we've been building a unit for the Ecology Building Society up in Silsden. There's a big barracks development just across the road, which is built on River Aire floodplain land, and they must have spent £2 or £3 million on the walls to keep the water back from this estate of very nice executive homes. The pressure on builders to go on to less and less desirable land is going to be there all the time, and I wouldn't be able to quote the national planning guidance on that. There was an update last year. I can't remember whether it covered that specifically, but why not? And one of the things we're looking at with floodplain land, instead of just building traditional houses, why don't you build houses that are designed to work with the floodplain, so they're actually up on stilts, as it were, to start with, and you're managing the area underneath it like a wetland. So you work with the RSPB or whatever and Natural England to actually manage that land around the houses. So basically, you're living in a nature reserve rather than just ripping up the natural environment. It's about working with the land rather than against it, which the building industry just come in with bulldozers and tear it up and do it the way they always have. But there's an opportunity there to think about doing things differently and use that hackneyed phrase, build back better. But why not look at doing things a different way? It's because the way that it has been done in the past isn't working. And there's an estate at Outerbridge, I think, that they built right down in the bottom, which regularly floods every time the river gets high down there. I don't know what their insurance premiums must be, if you can even insure them at all. But it seems daft to build more and more homes that are just, every time we get the increasing levels of water that we've seen coming in the last few years. There's going to be more and more people rained out of their houses on a more regular basis. It's a daft way of doing things.
Thank you. Jay, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I don't know if you have the same problem in Sheffield, but in Stoke, there's obviously there's a massive homeless problem, but there are so many streets, houses that are empty, and the high street's empty as well. And some of these buildings could be great little apartments. I just wondered, I don't know anything about housing. Is there a way to enforce landlords, say if a building's been vacated for such a long time, to ensure that people get to live there? Or could you, change the high street into like a small living community?
Does anyone want to come in on that? Does anyone know about that?
There are things you can do with commercial property when it's empty, and in actual fact, a lot of people are taking advantage of that. It's called permitted development, and you can do it without needing to apply for planning permission in a lot of instances. Seeing it down in London quite a lot, where they're turning old office blocks into basically warehouses for people, and they're just cramming them full of people. They don't have to comply with any fire regs or anything. It's another Grenfell waiting to happen, and it will before too long. But if it going back to your point, if it's managed properly, and this is where you need a good local plan. You can do it, and you can still have a community, even in a city centre. I think it's important to make sure that you've got a sense of community, so you're not just cramming as many people as possible into an area just to house them. That's part of the solution, but it's important that people identify with where they live as well, so that they look after it and care about it, and are proud to be part of that community. So it's not just about roofs over people's heads necessarily.
Can I just come in and mention about there's a Future High Streets Fund, which I think was a small pot of money that came through from the government. And Sheffield looked into that. They didn't miss it this time. We missed such a lot of money in this city, and that was to do with reconfiguring the high street. And it released a small amount of money to be able to scope out what the future could be for the high street in Sheffield. Now, I think that was a phase of money that's finished. if you want to, Jay, go and investigate and see if there's a second wave of that.
Yeah, thank you. That's so great. Do you know anything about private housing then that has been empty for quite a long time?
Anyone? I don't.
I believe councils do have powers. They do have some powers but they don't always exercise them.
I think
Put
each
the rent up. Council tax, sorry, they're going to charge.
but different councils will have probably have different policies on it, I think.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Declan, would be great if you can come in and talk about Acorn's new campaign shortly. I'm going to go over to Libby, who's from Hereford. You had a question.
I was just asking about community land trusts, whether there were any, but Rachel's answered that.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. Well, Declan, you are going to talk about Acorn's new campaign, I think.
Just briefly, I don't know very much about it other than they kind of shared it with us briefly yesterday, but it's all gone live today. If the host lets me share screen, I can show you the website, which has got all the details on it. They always have a very good, slick website for their campaigns, but all of it is very much Green Party policy kind of stuff.
Okay, I think I've let you share, but Alexi might have to help.
You have.
Okay.
So this is Housing is Health. So it's kind of, they've been building on this for a while. They had a petition at the very start of the lockdown about making sure that no one would be evicted as a result of not being able to pay their rent through losing work due to COVID-19. They've expanded that now to kind of make sure that no one is homeless. So there's been some stuff in the news about the fact that a lot of local councils have housed homeless people during the crisis, but they're already making plans to kind of move people back out of accommodation the second that they're able to. And so there's a few organisations that are kind of saying, look, if you're able to accommodate homeless people, then you should be accommodating homeless people, full stop. And I think it makes sense that we should be calling for that as well. So it's not a new policy at all for Acorn, talking about that people should have secure housing and that it's a human right. I think the Green Party's language in the housing policy is also that housing is a human right. Remember, it's only been updated, I think, 3-4 years ago. Let's see if I can.
I'm waiting for a call back from Louise Casey's team, the homelessness task force at MHCLG. I've been in touch with them about offering Reach as a solution for this. Obviously, Move On Housing is one of the things that we really want to do, and provide permanent long-term housing for people rather than just temporary overnight accommodation. So it gives people an opportunity to get their lives back on track, and obviously work with the wraparound care services that need to be engaged.
Is that similar to what the YMCA have done and what they've done in Amsterdam with some of the stacked containers, John?
The Keepbonen thing in Amsterdam was a student thing, and as somebody mentioned it earlier, it's similar to, I don't know whether you know what Social Bite and Josh Littlejohn are doing up in Edinburgh, and Jasper Thompson with Help Bristol's Homeless, where they're actually getting the homeless people to work on container homes that they can then go on to live in. If only on a short-term basis. I want to take it a step beyond that though, and have potentially long-term accommodation, not necessarily for people who've got particularly chaotic lifestyles because they've got different issues, but people who are forced into homelessness through economic things that the kind of things that are going to be brought on by COVID and by the no-deal Brexit that Tories seem so desperate for us to have. I think the economic damage that's going to bring, there's going to be a lot of people who need those kind of solutions very, very soon.
I was going to say, because I think there's a lot of people opposed to the idea of kind of creating a whole new raft of housing that's kind of even lower than the lowest level of housing we have now. I think some of it is the idea of taking a single shipping container and squeezing people into kind of stacked rows of those on a kind of semi-permanent basis. And obviously what you're talking about is creating good quality longer term housing, which is quite different from
just warehousing people is that's no solution at all.
Almost literally.
Yeah, I mean I'm a big fan of quoting sci-fi references and films like I, Robot and Ready Player One, where those kind of things, the dystopian future, and that that's the kind of thing you see in the background. Do we want a dystopian future for this country, or do we want some positive life chances for people? It doesn't have to be the way it is. It's the way it is because the people with the money are forcing us to make those choices all the time.
Dan, you had a question, and we've just kind of referred a bit to stack containers. Do you want to ask? Are you there, Dan?
Well, yeah, I think they were talking about it, but I just put in the chat that actually we had a friend who lived in that stack containers. It wasn't like that bad actually. We visited them and stayed over. I mean, I appreciate the idea that you don't want it to become social housing, and like
for students, it's
You're a little bit faint.
don't know how to solve that.
Okay, no, you're okay. You're okay.
Don't know what you got, what you didn't, but we had a friend who lived there. We also went and visited them. It was quite fine, to be honest. But I think, we have seen how some of the social projects here in England have gone, and like you say, trying to, people keeping it up didn't really work out so good. It sort of turns a bit wasteland, but we didn't think it was that bad.
I think in the Amsterdam one is also just for students, and they also had like a food hall there, and they had quite a lot of stuff which made it like a urban, nice kind of thing.
I've lived in a container house at Healy Farm, the prototype that we built, and they're absolutely fine to live in.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with them as housing, and if you do it with passive house style insulation, I lived in that for nearly 2 years and didn't pay a fuel bill. So nobody can tell me it can't be done. Nobody can tell me that they're not perfectly habitable, and you can make them really nice. I absolutely love living in that place. And as soon as we can get a pilot project on the ground and I can get some people in there to back up, so it's not just me saying it, I want to change the way that we do affordable housing so that people can have a choice. And it's not just going to be, it's not just going to be a big stack of rusty containers. They're going to be beautifully designed, beautifully executed homes that just give people a choice about where they want to live, and allow first-time buyers to get on the housing ladder, even if they're on 0 hours contracts. Allow people to get out of the crappy private rented stuff that's out there, because landlords just don't give a toss about the kind of environments people have to live in, as long as they're getting their rent. It needs some different thinking. That's all it is. And if it starts to happen and people see that it's good, then you'll get that impetus behind it, and we'll be able to change the system. But somebody needs to listen, and that's why I'm glad Natalie's involved in this, because hopefully, with the position that she's in, she can start getting people to take a bit of notice.
But if it's like a point of choice, wouldn't there be an argument to say that people could also choose if they want to potentially live in a stacked container or in their own plot? If someone said, the stacked one, we can get more onto a piece of land, it would be cheaper. Maybe some people would go for it. They wouldn't really care. It doesn't have to be a rusty thing. It can still be well designed, but just on top of each other.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. People should have a choice, and at the moment they don't, because the housing industry tells you what choice you're going to have, and you put up with it because that's all that's available. Unless you want to do a self-build, and there's so many hurdles put in the way of self-build because they don't want you to do it. There's a definite government policy to push people to be dependent or to be just subject to the system that's there. We need a different. We need options. You need that choice. If you want to live in a tiny home that's like 20 square meters, and that suits you, then why not? What's wrong with that? Why should we have a space standard that somebody's dreamed up? Somebody high flyer at the Home Office has dreamed up because they think it's a good idea, because you can't possibly live in something that's less than 25 square meters. You can if you want to. And some people, it's going to suit. Some people, it's the only thing they can afford. There's so many key workers in London. How do you afford to be a key worker in London? I just don't understand how the economics of that add up.
John, was there an example in New Zealand I was listening about a few weeks ago, about small houses? Have you picked up on that?
Yeah, there's a video on YouTube of a girl who did she's made a house out of a 10-foot container. That was a.
I think it's called the small home movement.
Well, there's a tiny home movement. It's massive in America, absolutely enormous. And yeah, there's people converting all kinds of things into living accommodation. Provided it's properly ventilated and properly designed, I really don't see there's any reason why people shouldn't be allowed the choice to live where they want to live.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes to go, so it'd be nice to hear from other people, and you can still put your questions in chat if you wish. I think this is Alexi, isn't it? Alexi, did you put the question in chat?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So
yeah, just before you go into that, a few days ago, Natalie saw a picture online about construction workers in the city centre, clearly not socially distancing, and she wrote an article talking about why are we rushing to do all this when the chances are these buildings may never be occupied. So do go and ask your question, Alexi.
Yeah, so a lot of the construction that's going on in Sheffield right now, previously, we've got a hell of a lot of it student accommodation. And it seems to me that there's a big prospect of students not coming back. And during the coronavirus crisis, that is some of the student accommodation has been used to house homeless people and rough sleepers and asylum seekers. And do you think there's any prospect of that continuing if students don't come back?
You want me to answer that one?
If you can, John. You may be out of your comfort zone, but
well, not entirely. I mean, a lot of that stuff that's built as student accommodation is clearly never designed to be student accommodation in the long term, and it's done like that because you get a capital gains tax exemption for 2 years for building student accommodation, and then after the 2 years, you can sell it, and you don't have to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds in capital gains tax. That's part of the reason. We don't tend to suffer here from quite the same level of property that's built for investors. But I don't know, and I think the question's been asked of the council, and as far as I know, there was never a satisfactory answer as to how much student accommodation there actually is. Apparently, there isn't enough. I'm sure I heard that they still needed. They reckon they needed another 20,000 student beds in Sheffield, but God knows where. Where they're going to put them and why. And as you say, if all the overseas students don't come back, then there should be a big hole in that planning.
So the other thing, John, was that the council lifted the cap. So they said if you build in the city centre in the ward, the city, you don't have to build any affordable housing.
Yeah.
And this was a kind of green light to developers.
Yeah.
Who put up the huge blocks? The ones that go up from 9 stories to 12 stories, and now they've got plans for 32 stories as well.
Yeah, because they should pay their Section 106 contribution.
An
amount of money, but the state. If I remember rightly, the Stokes Tiles one, which they're just doing at the moment, the council should have had something like £1.5 million in Section 106 contributions from that, and they've ended up getting nothing.
And no affordable housing within it.
No, well, they don't have to build any affordable housing in it. There's a zero rate at the whole of the city centre for affordable housing, as you say.
Yeah. 2015, they brought it in, and it came through, it slipped through, and the implications are that we're getting these huge, great blocks that are like walking down, inside a canyon.
Yeah. Well, the wind flows around. I remember I can't remember which one it was. There were panels flying off it not long ago. I think it might have been the St Paul's Tower one.
Oh yes, it did. Yeah. It was bus because it had landed in the street.
Yeah. So the other thing that makes me laugh is that massive great tower at the top of St Philip's Hill that they've just done, that they've ended up brick cladding because of the Grenfell restrictions on aluminium cladding. I mean, I don't know what anybody else thinks about the aesthetics of that. I think it's an absolute eyesore, and so is the one on Ecclesall Road. But imagine how often that's going to need repointing over the next 30 or 40 years. It's going to be an interesting job, that.
Yeah, I think we're just going to agree with each other, aren't we, John?
We've got 5 minutes left, so if anyone does want to come in who hasn't so far with a comment or a question, please do. Just thank Libby and Jade for joining us. We are a little bit Sheffield centric in this meeting. It was obviously publicised quite widely, but you've ended up as being only the two people from outside, but I hope you've got something out of it.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Don't forget.
Do go ahead, whoever that is.
That's
Mike.
Mike, yeah.
Oh, Mike as well. Sorry, from Hull. Apologies.
Hull gets forgetting every time.
Does anybody else want to come in?
No, it's my son. Yeah. No, we've got a big housing problem in Hull, and there are new houses going up. Some of them from the council, but they're not passive house standards, and the ones that will be going up that are going to be passive house are going to be built on greenfield. So I guess no one's challenging that, because at last we're getting some passive house stuff, but it's going to be on greenfield, which was mentioned earlier on. It's probably because it's a nice area.
But then likely to be affordable.
Okay, I've got Claire. Claire would like to come in and ask a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're okay.
No, I was just wondering, I don't know anything about housing. I work in healthcare. But I had a few questions. So is there anything like we could like ask for when we win Sheffield Council over? Like what standards should we be asking, and what is within the remit of the local council to do? Like, can we set passive house standards for all new builds, or would that have to be only council houses? And I know in Preston the council made a more concerted decision to try and use local companies and local firms to try and keep more of the Preston pound in Preston. And I think, John, you said that lots of companies are very big developers around here, and what kind of meaningful actions could a council take to improve all that kind of stuff that I know nothing about?
Thanks,
well,
Claire.
The council should be taking action, because there's a thing called the Social Value Act, where they should be using small local companies on a competitive tendering basis.
My very messy bedroom.
So they should be factoring that into all their tendering and so on, but it doesn't tend to happen because it creates work for them, and lots of people don't understand how it's supposed to work, so they just go with the big contracts that they're used to.
Because I know at the hospital we've got something called, like the NHS as an anchor institution, which is like, how can you as an NHS organisation like maximise your value to your community? And one of the things that they're trying to do is something called progressive procurement. So trying and buy in to the hospital from more local places by breaking up contracts and things like that. So I didn't know whether how much progressive procurement was happening at a kind of council level, if that's the right word.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for all of it, but it's the same thing under a different name. But the council are not very good at doing it. In terms of can they do it? Yeah, Exeter Council. Everything that gets done in Exeter, building wise, has to be passive house standard now, and that's been the case for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I saw that on. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. They've got an old people's development down there. I can't remember the name of it offhand. White Horse Way or something like that, where they've wiped out fuel bills for the people who lived in that accommodation, if they're still around, bless them. But yeah, it can be done. It's a matter of will. It's a matter of whether they're prepared to be innovative about things. And unfortunately, Sheffield Council are about as innovative as it can be done, and it's not difficult to do, and it's the way we should be doing it. But it requires somebody. It'd be great if we did tip the council over, and the Green Party could then get sensible policies like this brought in. But we'll wait and see.
We
ever allowed to have another election?
we started this meeting quite late by necessity, so I am going to wind it up